You already know this man. He is culturally reactionary, socially maladjusted, exploitative, and misogynistic. He occupies every sordid circle of society, from the boardroom to the backwoods. He is a Chud. And in our previous 4 expeditions, we cataloged some of the most dangerous male pathologies horror cinema has ever produced, building entry by stinking entry a terrible taxonomy of horror's modern man. But now we're changing things up a bit, diving face first into your suggestions for the most deranged Chuds known to man. It gets really weird. And I resent whoever suggested Antichrist because Jesus Christ, what an absolute train wreck of a film. So without further ado, I'm Goblinsburg, and these are some of your Chuds of choice. Spoilers are ahead. The first specimen of today's terrible taxonomy is Jack Torrance from Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, The Shining. Jack is a failed novelist and recovering alcoholic who takes a winter caretaking gig at the isolated, totally not haunted Overlook Hotel, which also affords him a conveniently secluded locale at which to hack his family into quivering chunks of meat. Because Jack has hurt his family before. He emotionally abused his wife and dislocated his son Danny's shoulder in a vicious drunken rage, and the story he likes to tell himself is that this was one bad night, ancient history. But it's not. It's prologue. This Chud got sober because his wife Wendy made him, and he's resented her for it ever since. Every scene between them is Jack barely feigning tolerance for a woman he considers a distasteful obstacle to his genius, reminding her that his recovery is a favor he's doing everyone. Meanwhile, Wendy walks on eggshells, tending his every need, endlessly appeasing him out of fear for her and her son's safety. And all the while, the dark supernatural forces gathering in the walls and winding halls of the Overlook begin frying Jack's brain. The hotel becomes, essentially, a haunted Faraday cage, and Jack becomes the Shitberg EMP cooking everyone inside. The haunting escalates. Jack stops writing his novel and starts writing the same sentence 500,000 times. He starts seeing ghosts, and they flatter his malignant narcissism, telling him that he's a genius saddled with a nagging shrew of a wife and a spooky son, the only thing standing between him and greatness. The dark power animating the hotel then cuts him loose in the Overlook's winding warrens to hunt his family down and slaughter them like animals. And this is what makes Jack the Minotaur. The Minotaur is what happens when a man becomes, permanently and completely, the absolute worst thing he's capable of being. He isn't a beast pretending to be a man, or a man occasionally dipping his toe into beastliness. The two have already fused into one single diabolical douchebag. And like his mythic namesake, Jack doesn't choose to become the thing at the center of the maze. He was just born bad, and fate did the rest. So, eventually, Wendy discovers the Minotaur has lost his marbles. He responds by menacing her up a staircase and calling her every degrading name in the book. She answers back with a baseball bat to the face and locks him in the walk-in freezer. The hotel's dirtbag guests spring him from snack jail, and he commits a hate crime against a psychic chef, and then hunts his own son through a hedge maze with an axe. A bestial, howling creature as monstrous as the myth he was patterned after. Because somewhere underneath the ghosts and the whiskey, Jack has always wanted to murder his family. Alcohol was just one of the many accelerants that set his Chud rage ablaze. But Danny, his son, survives by outsmarting the Minotaur in a fittingly ironic echo of how the original Minotaur myth, Theseus, escaped his own labyrinth, walking backwards into his own footprints, erasing his path so Jack can't follow. And in the end, the Minotaur freezes into a murder popsicle in the maze, still chasing his family, still certain he could right the imagined wrongs his fevered imagination and the homicidal ghosts of the Overlook cooked up to stoke his roid rage. The Minotaur was inside Jack the entire movie. He just needed a little supernatural push to become the beast he always was beneath the surface. And speaking of beasts, Chad from Tucker and Dead vs. Evil is a college kid on a camping trip who has clearly seen too many horror flicks and has understood none of them. When Tucker and Dal, two affable rednecks, save his smoke show friend Allison from drowning, Chad sees it as an Appalachian abduction ripped straight from Deliverance, because that's the story he's already decided he was in before anyone actually did anything wrong. This millennial misanthrope prejudges everyone he meets. His inferiority complex is as stiff as his popped collar. For hillbilly shaped reasons the plot reveals at the climax. He's clearly gunning to get into Allison's pants, she's clearly not interested, and you can tell this drives Chad up the wall. Because he's Chad. He's always gotten what he wants, using both his chiseled physique and his chudly personality to overpower the unsuspecting femoids and cowering cucks in his periphery. And this is what makes Chad the Sigma male. The Sigma male is patient zero of main character syndrome. Instead of observing events and making decisions based on facts, he narrates them in real time into whatever story fits his bulging ego best. And once Chad decides that Tucker and Dale are killers, his need for actual evidence flies straight into the wood chipper, right alongside his bros. And here's what makes the Sigma male less meme and more American Psycho. He's genuinely dangerous once he runs out of hillbillies to blame. He takes Tucker hostage and tortures him, cutting off his bowling fingers for information. He dognaps and threatens to kill Dale's dog. He kidnaps Allison and threatens to kill her unless she agrees to be his Stacy girlfriend. The Sigma male has fully replaced reality with a tall tale in which he's entitled to the girl, the violence, and the moral high ground all at the same time. And then the film delivers its ironic coup de grace. Newspaper clippings in Tucker and Dale's cabin that show 20 years ago, in the very massacre Chud has been citing as proof of killer hillbillies, the actual killer was Chad's own father. Chad isn't hunting monsters. He is half monster himself and always has been. Chad is eventually struck down by an asthma attack after Dale pocket sands chamomile tea at him and proceeds to fall out a window and disappears. The Sigma male spent the entire film insisting he was surrounded by killers. He was right. There was a killer. It was him. And he's still out there, waiting for a sequel that'll probably never come. And while we're on the subject of deluded killers, the next specimen of our terrible taxonomy is Peter Loew, a New York City literary agent with a trendy apartment, a rotating stable of women whose names he can't be arsed to remember, and absolutely nothing of substance underneath any of it. And then a bat flies through his window during a one-night stand, and instead of calling animal control, Peter gets aroused and decides that this is the beginning of his transformation into an actual vampire. It isn't. Rather, it's the inciting incident of a menacing sex pest with a body count. The movie begins with Peter hooking up with a woman named Rachel at a club. He brings her home and then she proceeds to bite him. Hot. Or she doesn't. Not. The film never really confirms it. What it does confirm is that Peter needs it to be true so badly that his reality recomports itself around his deranged, undead desire. And this is what makes Peter the deluded Dracula. The deluded Dracula doesn't simply transform into a monster, because he was always entitled and always cruel, always convinced, like the Sigma male before him, that the women in his orbit exist purely as supporting characters in his own story. And his vampire headcanon just gives that entitlement a set of fake fangs. And the woman who pays for that delusion again and again is his secretary, Alva. Peter's treatment of Alva is a vicious and sustained campaign of workplace abuse. He shows up uninvited at her home to manipulate her back into his orbit, because the deluded Dracula has never once considered that Alva might have a life, or boundaries, or the right to be anywhere he isn't. As his vampiric delusions deepen, the abuse stops being simply psychological. Peter stalks Alva through the empty building after hours. He corners her and rapes her while hallucinating she's another woman, erasing her identity entirely in the moment he assaults her, and then begs her to shoot him with a gun her brother secretly loaded with blanks. Well, Peter survives the blank cartridge and decides that this means he's been reborn as the Byzantine undead. Having gone full bloodsucker in his own mind, Peter buys novelty fangs, eats filth, and sleeps under an overturned couch like a coffin. He stops seeing his reflection. And then his delusion becomes fatal. Peter attacks a stranger at a club, leaving her bloodied and unconscious. She dies, and the deluded Dracula registers this abomination as proof that he's finally become the vampire he was always meant to be. Vengeance for all the women the deluded Dracula wronged comes in the form of Alva's brother Emilio, who finally corners Peter, still lost in his delirium, who hands Emilio a wooden stake and welcomes his own dramatic ending. Emilio graciously grants his wish and impales the deluded Dracula, and Loew dies, imagining the supposed vampire who supposedly turned him. Because even in death, Peter needed to use a woman to fulfill his nutbag narrative. The deluded Dracula drained the life from the women around him, and framed it as his own shitty love story. But his final victim, Alva, survived him. And that's the only ending that really matters. And while we're on the subject of vampires, our next chud comes from the movie Passengers. Now, give this movie a different soundtrack and it stops being a sci-fi thriller and becomes a horror film, one in which a woman is trapped alone on a spaceship with an unstable nutcase, because that's exactly what Passengers is. Said nutcase is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer who wakes up alone a few lifetimes too early on a centuries-long interstellar voyage to a corporate colony world with no way back into hibernation and no way back to reach Earth. Now, this is an awful premise. And for one full year, it's a genuinely sympathetic one, too. Jim is isolated and despondent and forced to talk to an android bartender just to hear another voice, and contemplate suicide. This is where the film wants your sympathy, and this is also where mine runs out. Because Jim doesn't stay alone. On his way back from his habit of getting shit-faced and bungee jumping into the void, he stumbles onto fellow passenger Aurora Lane, hibernating in her pod on her way to a new life that she chose for herself. And instead of respecting that her future exists on the other side of the century from him, Jim spends weeks studying her personnel files like a stalker building a dossier, then deliberately wakes her up. He kills the future she chose for herself so he doesn't have to be lonely. He lets her believe that it was dumb luck that did it, and then lets her fall in love with a lie that he personally engineered. And this is what makes Jim the crab. Put one crab in a bucket and it'll try to climb out. Put in another crab and something uglier happens. It grabs the first one by the leg and drags it back down, because crab misery prefers crab company. Jim was drowning in crab misery, alone and hopeless on the colony ship. Instead of accepting that fate, he reached out and pulled someone else down into the bucket with him, and had the chutzpah to call it love. And for a while, things are okay. Aurora and Jim do hot people shit for the camera, with Jim ingratiating himself to Aurora and Aurora allowing her frosty exterior to thaw as the crab scuttled around her doing his stupid mating ritual. All was well in the void. But then Aurora finds out the terrible truth. She attacks Jim and shuns him, understandably upset that her future has been killed and she's been sleeping with its murderer. The crab's response isn't to give her room to process, but rather he stalks her through the ship, cornering her while she eats, and when that fails, forces her to listen to his excuses over the ship's fucking intercom. Because the crab's discomfort with being disliked outweighed Aurora's right to simply not be near the man who turned her future into crab cakes. And then the plot conveniently arrives to rehabilitate Jim's reputation. The film revives and almost immediately kills again Lawrence Fishburne's character, purely to hand Jim a MacGuffin and to inform Aurora, on Jim's behalf, that he was an asshole, sure, but an understandable asshole, and she should probably bang him anyway. And then the ship malfunction that woke the crab early conveniently gives him a series of increasingly heroic side quests, replacing ship components, spacewalking to vent a reactor, nearly dying in the vacuum of space for a dollop of noble sacrifice. Engineered so precisely to redeem his character that the film essentially argues that Jim was entitled to Aurora's forgiveness and her punene for fixing their spaceship. As if his own survival instincts cancel out the fact that he stole the next 80 years of her life. So of course, Aurora realizes that she really does love Jim and saves him, ultimately choosing to stay awake rather than take the one hibernation pod that could still save her. Not because Jim changed, but because the film and Chris Pratt's agent needed a heroic Hollywood ending badly enough to have her forgive a kidnapper, so long as he says sorry and nearly dies along the way. God, I hate this guy and I hate this movie. The crab spent the whole movie insisting that he couldn't help himself. Turns out that's the most honest thing he could have said, because a crab can't help itself either. But that doesn't mean you let it back into the bucket with you. And speaking of crabs, Jeremiah Sand of Nick Cage masterpiece Mandy, the penultimate chud of this terrible taxonomy, is the leader of a cult called Children of the New Dawn, which sounds like a faction out of Fallout and functions like a hostage situation. He has cultists, robes, a folk singer voice he's very clearly proud of, and absolutely nothing behind any of it. Because Jeremiah Sand is just a chud of a man who failed at being a musician and pivoted directly into cult leadership instead. Because if you can't earn adoration with your songwriting prowess, you can always just kidnap and brainwash your followers. He sees Mandy walking to work one day and decides he wants her, orders his mercenary gang of demonic drug-addicted bikers to kidnap her and has her stung by a psychedelic wasp, and has her presented to him like an offering. bound and drugged, because in Jeremiah Sand's mythology, worship bypasses consent. This is what makes Jeremiah the impotent idol. The impotent idol builds an entire religion around the one thing he desperately needs everyone to stop noticing: that he has no actual power, no true talent, and no real divinity. Just a costume and control over a coterie of mentally ill sycophants. He puts on a record and serenades the bound, drugged Mandy with his psychedelic folk slop, fully expecting this dogshit to be the transcendent performance that finally proves he's worth surrendering to. And then he shows her his dick. Mandy laughs at him and at it, and a lifetime of failure collapses in real time into something deflated and small, right in front of the one audience he actually needed to buy his act. Mandy was seeing him fully, and what she saw made her laugh. And it made me laugh too. The impotent idol's response to that humiliation is straight up murder. Because the only thing Jeremiah's fragile, failed frontman ego can do with rejection is make sure the woman who delivered it can never do it again. But this doesn't save him, because Red comes for the whole operation, cult and biker gang alike. And by the time he reaches Jeremiah, the impotent idol finally gets the captive audience he's always wanted, just not in the way he was hoping for. Mother Marlene offers to give Red amazing head, and he gladly obliges, and then throws it at Jeremiah, who also offers desperate fellatio, and then gets his skull crushed and burns while the church and the whole failed mythology goes up in ashes around him. Jeremiah Sam built a religion so no woman would ever laugh at him again. He succeeded, just not in the way he envisioned. And finally, while we're on the subject of existential despair, Antichrist is a film about two profoundly fucked up people locked in a cabin who are actively destroying each other and somehow still find the time to destroy themselves along the way. And just to be clear right off the bat, nobody in this film is a good person. And Lars von Trier, having written this fresh out of the mental hospital for clinical depression, is not really interested in giving us one. But we're here to talk about Willem Dafoe's character, him, specifically. Because even in a film this committed to total moral failure, this final specimen manages his own distinct tincture of terrible. Willem Dafoe's character is a therapist. After their toddler walks out of a window while they're mid-coitus, his wife, aka she, collapses into grief so severe it hospitalizes her. And he decides he can do her psychiatric care better himself, so he pulls her out of the hospital and appoints himself her doctor. Note that this man is not a psychiatrist, and therefore has no medical training, and isn't even remotely qualified to tell her she doesn't need the medication and hospitalization she's been prescribed. Not to mention the ethical obscenity of treating your own wife as a patient over the death of your own son. And this is what makes him the Tick. The Tick doesn't grieve alongside his wife. He attaches to her and feeds, extracting psychoanalysis, control, and the satisfaction of being needed, all the while slowly injecting the toxin of his own egomania into her under the pretense of treatment. And instead of recognizing a person experiencing a psychological crisis and getting a real help, he reprimands, corrects, and argues with her while she actively disintegrates in front of him. He treats her breakdown as an intellectual exercise and not as a psychic wound to tend. The film affixes its own metaphor to the Tick the morning he falls asleep with his arm out the window and wakes up with a colony of bloated ticks feeding on his skin. Subtle, Lars. Really subtle. Antichrist's third act culminates in a clusterfuck of biblical proportions, and gives the phrase bloody climax an upsetting new meaning. She smashes a block of wood onto his erection. She then cranks his tractor until he literally shoots blood. She drills a hole through his leg and bolts a grindstone directly onto the wound so he can't run, and then circumcises herself with a pair of rusty shears because Lars von Trier apparently woke up one morning and decided the world hadn't suffered enough. A talking fox shows up at one point and in Willem Dafoe's voice informs him that chaos reigns. Yes, thank you, Mr. Fox. I had gathered as much as well. In the end, he survives, strangling her, burning her body, and walking away from the scene of the crime. The Tick fed until there was nothing left, and ends up alone on a hillside, watching a procession of dead women walk past him into the trees. Nobody gets absolution here, and the world is a worse place for having experienced this smoking crater shitshow of a movie. And he, unfortunately for everyone, gets to keep breathing. 6 Chuds, 6 different flavors of rot, all of them yours. Thanks for hunting Chuds with me. Drop your next picks in the comments, because this expedition into the heart of Chudness is resupplying and will get underway again soon. Like, hype, comment, sub, and I will see you in the next one and in the next taxonomy.